I'm your host, Frank Maurice. Welcome back to Ratchet and Frank TV. Here we are back in the studio. I hope you all enjoyed the holiday. We have a lot to do today, so let's jump into it. The first thing we're going to do is remove the EGR cooler mounting brackets from the side of the engine. We'll break all the bolts loose and we'll start with this right one. It's way easier to remove than the left one just because there's nothing in the way. If the footage looks a little bright in the beginning of this video, that is totally my fault. I'm still messing around with the lighting in my studio, but towards the end of the video, it does come out much better, and I think I'm starting to get the hang of it. With the right bracket out of the way, we'll turn our love towards the left one. It's just another couple of bolts, but the heat shield is actually bolted onto the bottom of the bracket. It will have to be removed in order to make clearance for the bracket's removal. You can see I actually ended up using my extension to bend that oil drain pipe for the turbo out of the way a little bit, just so I could get a good angle on that bolt. Super important as to not strip it. With the heat shield unbolted, I could slip it up and out of the way, then I could focus on the bracket and run the last bolt out. Always remember that when a heavy object is being held up by a single bolt, that single bolt is under a lot of tension, so apply pressure in the opposite direction so you do not ruin those threads as we remove the bolt. With the EGR cooler brackets out of the way, we could focus on the oil filter housing. The first thing to do is remove all the lines that are going to hold it to the block. There's actually not much that needs to come off of the filter housing itself, as most of the lines can stay on and it can be removed as one large unit. We've talked about these press-in seals before that you'll find all over Mack Volvo engines. These pipes are pretty thin, they're very easy to kink or damage if you're not careful, so always go from a different spot. Don't hit the same spot twice, and eventually they will pop out. We'll pull off some of this masking tape while we're over here, just so we don't have to later. These are the kind of shots that make me really appreciate doing this entire thing in 4K, because honestly, you don't even see this clear with your eyes while you're doing this type of work. And at least for me, it opens up a whole new aspect of wrenching to be able to see these breathtaking shots with dirt and particles of dust flying through the air. It's just really, really cool. I'll hit the oil filter housing bolts with a little bit of penetrating oil just to make sure that nothing snaps off in the block, as that would be a critical failure at this point. There are a few spots that the filter housing seals, and it's also why it's still being held up. There's the two pipes on top, as well as the large seal behind the filter housing that goes directly to the crankcase. I'll grab my rubber mallet and evenly tap along the entire top side of the filter housing until I find a spot that gives, and from there, one more swift tap usually makes the rest of the housing follow suit. We're making good progress, but we're nowhere near done for the day. Let's pop this filter housing off to the side and continue moving forward. Turn my head a little bit down and we are going to get the starter off of the engine. In my particular situation, there's no wiring here attached, so it's very easy. All we have to do is remove the 3 cap nuts and slip the starter out of the flywheel housing. So I'm gonna be honest with you, I kinda dropped the ball a little bit and I forgot to press play on the 4K camera while I was taking off the Harmonic Balancer. However, the backup camera was recording, needless to say, and if the milk's already spilt, then why cry about it? So let's just keep moving forward. I'm generously soaking this thing in penetrating oil. The Mack MP series and the Volvo D series Harmonic Balancers are notorious for sticking up on the crankshafts, and it requires a lot of patience to get these off without damaging them. That's because they bend very easily, almost like a giant penny. You could see I'm walking from side to side, giving little motions with my large pry bar, just to get the Harmonic Balancer to work itself forward off the crankshaft. This footage is sped up over 1,000 times, so it may look like I'm moving pretty fast. I can assure you that is not the case. This is a very slow process. All in all, it probably took me like 20-25 minutes just to get this balancer off the crankshaft. Every time I get the balancer to make a significant movement, I try to use a little bit more penetrating oil. That stuff really makes a big difference. As long as you take your time, you should not have any issues, and the balancer should pop itself right off, and it even dropped itself into the forward engine mount for us. With the balancer off the front of the crank, we now have free access to the water pump and water pump housing. It's quite simple to remove. We don't have to take the pulley off of the pump. Instead, we could just take the bolts out of the water pump that hold it onto the pump housing. There are 6 bolts we will remove right now, 3 on the top and 3 on the bottom. You see me here putting that wobble extension to really good use. I love those things so much. Very rarely do I use swivels, and even in my box at work, it's all wobble extensions for my extension section. In order to separate the water pump from the pump housing, we're going to use a strike chisel and very gently twist it just so that the blade separates the two surfaces. Pull the pump and the gasket off the front of the housing, and we'll get a little bit more of that masking tape off while we have a second. This pipe on the back of the water pump housing changes depending on the chassis setup, but we're going to have to remove it. There are 3 bolts, 2 that hold the pipe to the water pump housing on the back side of it, as well as one larger one that holds it directly to the block. There are totally a ton of things I keep finding that tell me somebody recently worked on this engine, just like this wet anti-seize compound. That stuff almost looks brand new. I'll grab my wrench and give that backing WAPU pipe a good slap and pull it right off. There's a big O-ring between the housing and that pipe. A lot of people forget to replace it and they end up having to go back and repair a leak. We'll jump back around to the front of the engine and we will take off all of the water pump housing bolts on the front of the engine block. Depending on how excited your engine is to come apart, your water pump housing may take itself off like mine did. There's that infamous square gasket that will leak within a couple of months of your injector cups going bad. Thank you guys so much for watching. That's all for today. I will see you on the next one.